in Chattanooga, Tennessee, David Tulis.
We hope you have a wonderful 4th of July weekend. If you're off today, we thank you for joining us here. New listener, we love having a new listener. I'm on every morning at 9 o'clock, weekday morning. David Tulis, we're AM 1240 and FM 92.7. Also on high def at 95.3 HD4. Brought to you by Dahlia's and Clay Whitaker. Clay Whitaker, probably the finest attorney in Chattanooga, who's leading the Hanson Melvin lawsuit against the Department of Police here in Chattanooga for an abusive arrest outside the authority of probable cause. That being the only way in which a state official can touch you, right? Or search you has to be by probable cause. You can't be otherwise molested or bothered, detained, arrested, stopped, questioned apart from that. And that case will show a lot about how the department operates. Here on the 4th of July, we're thinking about our constitutional heritage and government, and we're marking the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We're guaranteed in one of the constitutional articles the following: the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. So that promise of republican government is something that the Constitution promises that the federal government will remain, as well as the states also shall be in that form. It's not just the states that will be pursued to have it, but the national state as well. And there seems to have been, Sam Spade, a loss of that promise. Do we have Republican government anymore in the United States, Sam?
I guess a lot of that depends on your definition of Republican, but by the definition that anybody that I know thinks of, the answer is definitely no, because we don't have representation. The people that we elect to Congress are quickly bought out by the high central authorities and the money printing, and they no longer represent us. That happens very quickly. If we're lucky, we may have their attention for maybe a year. In most instances, we wind up not being able to get their attention at all once they are elected.
And that's because for the individual representative or senator, he goes up there with high hopes, high aspirations, representing the people, promising he's going to restrain the central power. He's going to bring more equity back and kind of bring the government more in line with the Constitution as he's able. But his perspective changes. Initially, he's there to represent his people, his voters, to the state. But I think what happens is there's a slow turning around so that he becomes effectively the face of the government to the people. He represents the government to the people, and they look at him and petition him, and he is the human face, the human visage on the national government. We think of Senator Corker, Senator Alexander, and Chuck Fleischmann, our representative. They are the face of national government, and somehow they humanize the behemoth.
Yes, that's a very, very good way to put it. They are turned 180 degrees from the direction they are launched in, and their task becomes not one of controlling the national government, but turning around and controlling the voters that vote for them.
Well, let's say Sam Spade that Rep. Fleischmann and others like him had not done that. Let's say that they continued to turn their faces to the government. They represent us. In effect, their backs are turned to us because they are our face to it and not its face to us. How would things be different, do you think? Would we have more liberty? Would we have more constitutional independence, like what we read about and hear about for July 4?
I think you're asking about an animal that cannot exist. It's hard for me to conceive of what you're talking about. I'm sorry. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the central government in our society has become so overwhelmingly powerful through a number of mechanisms, the primary one being the ability to create money and buy people off, that you can't send any individual out there, no matter how good, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how honest, and expect them not to be turned within a very short time. So I can't conceive of an answer to your question.
What you're saying, Sam, it has a depressive effect on the listener's interest in national politics, his desire to follow the news about President Trump, about Congress, about the latest bill in the general legislature.
It does, but more than that, it represents a barrier between him actually being able to take charge of his portion of government and what government actually does. I mean, if you look at so many of the things that go on in our society. To take a very big example, the presidential elections. Ask yourself when the last time somebody that you wanted to get elected got elected and did what you wanted. Frankly, I can't remember it having happened since probably Eisenhower in my case. I'm to be very blunt about that. I mean, I'm an old man and I do remember Eisenhower. All right. Reagan, I elected Reagan with the hopes that he would go in and turn things around. He walked up there and he was quickly turned. I elected Carter with the hopes that he would go turn things around. He was quickly turned. I cannot see anybody that went up there to do what he was told to do and proceeded to try and do it. And I expect if you talk to somebody on the liberal side of the spectrum here, local person, you'll get the same answer from them. They'll be able to say, well, I elected Obama because I wanted him to go up there and solve the war problem. And here he became our war president. Yeah, well, that's the problem. He was turned by the establishment.
Well, what about Obamacare? Is that not fulfilling a progressive promise, Sam?
It is, in my opinion, no. In my opinion, it was an attempt to suppress the promise by catering to a fascist medical establishment. You have to understand that what we have in our society and what we're trying to support economically is not a competitive medical market in which goods and services are sold at a reasonable price to anybody that wants them. What we have is a monopoly that's designed specifically to make medical services as expensive as you possibly can make them. And Obamacare is there to tax every penny we can from you so that we can pay them to those people that we have given a monopoly to supply you with medical services. So you've really got fascism writ large in the medical system.
So you've created a control market where the major players have guaranteed incomes and guaranteed customer base.
Exactly.
And inflated prices.
Exactly. And I see this every day. I do not go to an MD. I go to an osteopath because I have so many problems with all the regulations tied to MDs. And I go out of my way to buy and find non-medical solutions to my medical problems, non-official solutions, even though I am covered by medical insurance because I have to be because of the fact that I'm over 65.
Sir John Glove, the English military man and writer, in his famous 1976 essay, The Fate of Empires, says that every empire that he looked at lasted 250 years. If that's the case, if the founding in 1776 was the beginning of the American nation and empire, then we have an end of this contraption in 2026. That's 9 years out. What do you make of this kind of analysis, Sam Spade?
I believe there's a grain of truth in that. Because empires, like any other institution, like any other organism, grow old and die. And that is an inevitable process. And I believe we're very near the end of the death of the American empire. I hesitate to say exactly 250 years. I mean, this is a very variable situation. There's so many issues. But I think there's more than a grain of truth in what he says.
When you say that, you don't have a very dour look on your face. In fact, there's something of a smile in your thinking that may be close or approximate lifetime of the federal behemoth, as we say, or gargantuan. Why is the end of the federal cartel not awfully bad news? What good is there in that, and how does local economy thinking fit into the solutions to this problem of demise?
Well, I think we're coming into a crisis. It's going to be a national crisis, and I'm optimistic about the results of that crisis. And so I kind of look forward to it, even though it's going to be very stressful and frankly, very unhealthy for a large number of people. The crisis, I believe, is caused by the same thing that caused the Revolutionary War. I think that's a apropos time to talk about that. And that was the creation of debt money by the British government, the British Crown, the Bank of England was a printer of debt money, and it used that debt money to control the world that it attempted to conquer. And the United States began to feel, well, we weren't the United States, the colonies at the time, began to feel the effects of this debt money, began to feel the effects of this oppression, and finally said, that's enough. We don't want to be forced to be part of a large multinational imperialist organization centered in London.
Right. We were the subject.
We want to be our own people.
Right. We were the subject of mercantilist economics, which is to say that there's a captive supply and buyer market. The colonies were allowed to trade only with the British. Of course, it was a very ferocious trade, illegal trade among in the New Hebrides. And there's a book. By I think Gertrude Himmelfarb on that question. It's called The First Salute. And in mercantilist economies, we buy British goods and sell British raw materials.
Actually, the mercantilism is an excellent way of describing it if you take the broadest definition of mercantilism. It's what went on in a narrow sense in the British Empire, but it's also what produced the Civil War, because the South represented a series of captive colonies for the North to use to get cheap resources and dump their manufactured products on cheap. So that was a mercantilism cycle again, and we are now exactly in that same conflict between cities like Chattanooga, which, if you think about it, functionally are the same size as Boston's were back then, as New York's were back then, as Washington's were back then, and the megapolises in the United States, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the Los Angeleses, who are now the equivalent of what was back then the Londons of the world. So we're really up against the same issue in which we are tired of having printed money be used to control everything we see, everything we eat, where our children go to school and what they learn. We're just tired of it, and we want to be left alone, and that's what's going on.
Well, talk about what the listener can do in his own life in the context of this conflict that you're describing. How are local economy solutions really going to be effective and not just dreaming or sentimentalism, Sam Spade?
Well, right now it appears to be dreaming or sentimentalism because the grip of that central authority is so powerful because of its ability to print money. People don't realize, 2008, the Fed created $225 billion worth of M1 money. That's dollars and checking accounts. $225 billion is enough to buy a huge list, including all the media, including all the schools and education systems, including all the police forces. When that breaks, when that money printing breaks, and it's about to break, they've finally reached the end of it, suddenly our shackles will fall away. And that's when localism will become very important.
I think globally, central banks are printing or producing or creating from nothing. I think, is it maybe 20 or 200 billion in new debt a month. It's a very large amount in global mass inflation.
Yeah, it's horrendous. And in fact, it's even an impossible number to get your hands on because you have to define money first. They're creating bonds. They're creating bills. These things don't circulate, so I would not consider them to be money. The number that I gave you is the strict interpretation of just dollar bills and checking accounts.
Well, let's talk some more, Sam Spade, about local economy solutions. How can the listener, what does he need to think? What does he need to be doing? What are some steps he can be thinking about that are in the context of our narrative here?
Well, the first step that I would take is to get your house in order. Get out of the debt system, get away from being locked in to the entire dollar structure that's going to drag you down with it. That means find a way to cut back on your expenses, cut back on your everyday expenses, and so that you can start to pay off your debt. Find ways of beginning to save money. Find ways of beginning to put aside food, because food disruption is going to occur when this event happens. Find ways to ensure you have clean water, because water is going to become hard to get. Find ways to ensure that you're healthy, because the healthcare system is going to begin to collapse. Start looking, first of all, at the most local aspect, which is yourself, and then the next level, which is your family, and the next level, which is your community, and finally up to the level that I think is going to be the survival level when this crisis hits, which is the Chattanooga city. I think the city as a community is going to continue to survive and function.
I think it's hard for the listener to think in those terms, Sam, because we're obsessed with the news. We have universal news. We have, of course, here on Nooga Radio, we have CBS News, always focusing on what's happening in Washington and other global capitals. And so it's hard for the listener to think that it really matters, to think that Mayor Burke's police chief search committee is important, to think that what city council does, what the county commission does are important, or that what he does in his business is really that important, because those are just details in the larger national picture, which his mind is continually fed with information and news. So I'm asserting, maybe wrongly or overstating the danger here, but I'm asserting that the national narrative is so strong in the ubiquitous media that we can't think locally. We just almost can't think in terms of local solutions anymore, of practical decentralization.
Well, that's because the money comes into the national organizations, the national media, in order to control what they say and broadcast that to you. It's very expensive to run a national TV station. Where are they going to get the money? Well, they have to get the advertisers. Now the government's in a position where they can come through with printed money, in essence, borrow money and turn around and go to the TV stations and say, listen, we will pay for your advertising. We will buy up your stock. We will keep you guys afloat if you just deliver our message. And so the only way in this kind of onslaught of controlled media that our listener is going to find out what's really going on, our listener is going to find out how he really should structure his life to get through this crisis, is to go to medias that are not desperate for money, that are not writ large, where they have a big bulldog they have to feed every day, and they therefore sell their souls to the centralizing agencies of Washington. And that means this radio station, that means various sources on the internet, that means local news. That's
that would
where
be, for example, Chattanooga.com or Nooga.com, which are locally owned media outfits, and certainly Mark West, for example, has a political blog. I think he posts once a week. But on outfits like that, you have a loco-centric perspective. In a way, it's kind of humorous to think about it. We here in Chattanooga think we are the center of the universe, and that what happens in City Hall is more important than what happens in the hallowed halls of Congress in Washington.
But that is true, because if you think about it, when you worry about where you're going to get your next meal, when you worry about whether you're going to be attacked in the streets because of violence, when you worry about whether your children are going to get clean water to drink, all those are local issues. And therefore, those are issues that we need to be prepared to deal with. Now, until recently, the federal government used its money to control those local issues. That's beginning to break down. And that's the reason you need to start preparing to get involved in local issues very heavily, because you're going to have the chance.
So in the larger scale, Sam Spade, decentralization is the answer to centralization and the collapse of its utility. We've reached the apogee, the highest point of centralization some time ago, and now we're in the sort of the aftermath of it. What define centralization and define decentralization in a practical way, would you?
Well, centralization is a environment in which a few use various pieces of machinery, political machinery and economic machinery, to control the way the rest of the country behaves and acts and thinks. And to do that, they have to make the rest of the country think and behave and act in a common way. Decentralization is one in which the grassroots, the common man, makes those decisions and sends that information up the top. So that's really the main difference between centralization and decentralization, is where is the power located? Is the power located at the grassroots, coming upwards to politicians, in which case they are responsive to you, or is the power at the very top, coming down from politicians, in which case they're more concerned with pushing you into doing what they want, not the other way around?
And in centralized systems, to keep power, there's less and less dissent accepted by the agency or by the larger organism, which is to say it becomes monocultural, a single culture where there's no suppleness anymore. There's no willingness to deal with contingencies or dissent or bad news or things that are not part of the main narrative. And so you have a system which is increasingly brittle, increasingly coercive and compulsory, and getting larger and larger and more of a drag on the economy overall.
Exactly. The phrase that jumps to mind for me is being a brick in the wall. I mean, in order to construct a wall, you have to make all your bricks the same size. And so any central organization that wants to build this massive edifice of walls and fortresses and structures to support its own strength has to first go about cutting us all down into the same shape so we can all become bricks in their wall.
And the states, in a way, have become bricks in the federal wall.
Exactly.
This is David Tulis. We're talking with Sam Spade about the 4th of July and the geopolitics behind the story of the 4th of July, the bid for independence of the colonies against the British crown, British king who was acting outside of, the British legislature, which was acting outside of its authority. The colonies were under the king. We are talking with Sam. I've got some important messages for you. Please make note. We are Nooga Radio, and if you support our advertisers, you support me, David Tulis, brought to you by Nooganomics.com.
In-depth traffic, news, and information.